Speaker. On the outset, I want to let you know that I will be sharing my time with the member for Edmonton-Strathcona. Mr. Speaker, C-23 has been criticized by academics and elections officials, and more importantly, by many, many Canadian citizens as undemocratic. Just this morning on my trip to Ottawa, I had a chance to read the Globe and Mail, and they've been editorializing Bill C-23 for over six days now, I think, Mr. Speaker, and sharing more information on this unfair Elections Act than the government is with Canadians. I thank the Globe and Mail, and in today's piece, they decried, and I quote, "For the good of the country, kill this bill." End quote. And Mr. Speaker, I just couldn't agree any more than what the Globe and Mail's editorial said today. I'd like to share some more of what I read today. And I quote again, "The government has touted the bill's changes to voting rules as needed to prevent voter fraud. That's a red herring. There's no evidence that vouching, a process the bill eliminates, led to widespread fraud. The government has resorted to defending itself with out-of-context citations from experts whose conclusions are the opposite of what the government pretends. Tightening the rules will prevent many eligible Canadians from voting. Those affected are mostly not Conservative voters. Other changes create a giant partisan loophole in campaign spending laws to the advantage of the Conservatives. Why? The bill gives incumbent parties in each riding the power to name key election officials instead of leaving the job to an impartial Elections Canada. Why? Bill C-23 also takes direct aim at Elections Canada in other ways, neutering its ability to conduct public outreach campaigns and encouraging voting. Why? It also meddles with Elections Canada's ability to investigate wrongdoing or communicate the results of investigations. Why?" End quote. Mr. Speaker, it's not just me or the Globe and Mail. Many, many Canadians are asking the same questions. Why are the Conservatives trying to stop voters, stop Canadians from actually participating in our general election? Time and time again, experts have been saying that Bill C-23 aims to fix problems that aren't really there. This bill is actually exacerbating the real problem with Canada's electoral system, low voter engagement. Voter participation is low, and engaging new voters in a time when Canadians are cynical about government is actually an uphill battle. And my question is, why are the Conservatives trying to make voting harder when we actually should be making it easier and more accessible, and just making it as accessible as possible? The answer is simple and very discouraging, Mr. Speaker, because the Unfair Elections Act makes it easier for the Conservatives to win. They want to make it harder. They want to make it harder for people who don't vote Conservative to vote at all. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians rely on vouching and voter identification cards to prove that they have the right to vote. This is especially true for young people, new Canadians, Aboriginal people, and seniors living in residence. Bill C-23 will put an end to vouching practices. Vouching has long been an accepted practice. Not everyone has the financial means to secure an ID, Mr. Speaker. Not everyone in Canada is wealthy. Aboriginal peoples, university students living away from home, the homeless, or seniors in residence are all groups that are less likely to have eligible ID or mail on hand, and thus requiring someone to vouch for them. In the last election, approximately 100,000 people used vouching to exercise their right to vote. In addition, voter cards will no longer be accepted to confirm identification. The use of voter ID cards, the notice of registration on the electoral list that is sent to voters, benefits those who face challenges in establishing their address when it's time to vote. Example, youth on campus, seniors, and Aboriginal people. Many Aboriginal people wait months and months to get their treaty cards, Mr. Speaker. They may not have access to other alternative forms of ID. Elderly couples may have their spouse to vouch for them because only one of their names is on the registered mail. The rate of error is very small when using voter ID cards, and the allowance worked to enfranchise many. So why get rid of it? Only reason I can see is to disenfranchise voters. My riding of Scarborough-Rouge River is large and diverse, Mr. Speaker. We have a high population of new Canadians who may face some difficulties when they go to the polls next election. For some, the 2015 election will be their first opportunity to vote federally. What a warm welcome to their new home. Sorry you can't vote. We also have the highest youth-to-population ratio in the Greater Toronto Area in Scarborough-Rouge River, Mr. Speaker. That's approximately 32,000 between the ages of 18 to 34. The National Youth Survey conducted by Elections Canada after the 2011 election found that among Canadians aged 18 to 34 who didn't vote, 15% said that their decision was influenced by their inability to provide proof of identification, while another 16% indicated that they were influenced by their inability to provide proof of address. But, Mr. Speaker, don't take my word for it. Although the Conservatives didn't feel the need to consult the Chief Electoral Officer, Mark Maynard, he had more than enough to say about vouching in testimony that he provided at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee that, of course, we know that the Conservatives wish that they could forget. And luckily for us and all of Canada, it's on the public record. The Chief Electoral Officer had this to say on vouching, and I'm going to quote him from committee. It has been pointed out that vouching is a complex procedure and that numerous procedural irregularities were found to have been committed at the last general election in connection with vouching. It is critical to understand that, as recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada, the vast majority of these were strictly record-keeping errors by poll workers documenting the vouching process and not fraud or even irregularities that could compromise an election. There is no evidence tying these errors to ineligible electors being allowed to vote. End quote. That's a fairly clear demonstration that vouching isn't leading to election fraud, Mr. Speaker. When asked publicly about why they're banning vouching and the use of voter information cards, Conservatives say that it's because they're trying to crack down on fraud. But it doesn't make sense, Mr. Speaker. We know that they're not cracking down on fraud. Elections Canada has been clear. There is no evidence to suggest that vouching or the use of voter information cards has actually led to fraud. There's no evidence to suggest vouching or voter information cards are connected to electoral fraud. There is no evidence to show that this legislation is justified in ending vouching and ending the use of voter information cards. The only case of voter fraud using voter ID cards that the Conservatives could give us was, of course, when the member for Mississauga-Streetsville said that he had witnessed with his own two eyes that voter fraud was happening using voter ID cards. And, of course, as the House knows now, that this is not the case, which begs the question, why did the member for Mississauga-Streetsville bring it up anyway if he knew it wasn't true? Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, this Unfair Elections Act is not just an attack on voter access, but also on education. Bill C-23 would strip the Chief Electoral Officer's power to engage in public education. Under the Unfair Elections Act, the Chief Electoral Officer is now limited to discussing only certain aspects of the electoral process: when, where, and how to vote. Literally the least amount of information that the Chief Electoral Officer and Elections Canada can give to Canadians. That's all they're allowed to say. This is absolutely not a way to increase voter participation, Mr. Speaker. This is very much a departure from many Western democracies. Mr. Speaker, traditionally, bodies that oversee elections have the mandate to educate the public on how to vote. If Elections Canada is not allowed to do the job, then who will? The Conservatives are counting on the probability that nobody will. The Conservatives would rather change the rules of the game than play by the rules, and we know that with this majority government, what they've been doing is just writing their own rules, making it up as they're going along. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have a track record of breaking election laws with their in-and-out scheme, robocalls designed to suppress opposition votes, and rule-breaking overspending by Conservative ministers, not to mention, of course, charges against the Prime Minister's former ethics spokesperson, the MP for Peterborough. But the Conservatives had a chance with Bill C-23 to do the right thing and introduce a bill to crack down on real electoral fraud. But they couldn't help themselves from tacking on cynical measures designed to tilt the playing field in their favor and make it harder for some groups of Canadians to vote. And like I said before, Mr. Speaker, that's young people, seniors, Aboriginal people, homeless people, and I know my time is running out, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to say one last thing. As the Globe and Mail's editorial said this morning, I'm going to quote them again. For the good of this country, kill this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires?
The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Neigette-Témiscouata-les-Basques. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I listened with pleasure to my colleague's speech. When we talk about the need to have someone vouch for us, we're often talking about a situation such as the ones my colleague described, that is, where the identification is not available. Some particular groups have a lot of problems getting that kind of identification and do not have access to it. It creates a bad impression when the government gives its views, because it looks like this information is very easy to get. I would like my colleague to talk about the situations where people have a hard time getting identification.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his question and intervention. Like I mentioned, there are many situations where people have difficulty getting their hands on ID. A young person who's going to be voting for the first time, who may not have a driver's license, who doesn't have any other identification, or who doesn't have a utility bill in their name because they live with their parents, will not have any form of identification and may need their parents to vouch for them, as this is my child who is 18 years old and Canadian citizen and should be able to vote because they live with me in my home, may not have identification. Seniors living in residence traditionally don't have identification cards or driver's license or some sort of ID with their address on it that they're walking around with. I mentioned Aboriginal people who are waiting weeks and weeks, months and months for their treaty cards to come. Mr. Speaker, I want to mention on the topic of young people that when I mentioned that 15 and 16% of Canadians, young people, when they said they couldn't vote, 15% said that they couldn't provide proof of ID, and 16% they couldn't provide proof of address. And these barriers to voting for young people is particularly pronounced among Aboriginal youth, where 20% said that they couldn't vote because they couldn't, 20 and 23% for ID and proof of address, and with youth with disabilities who were 28% and 33% who couldn't vote because they couldn't provide proof of ID and proof of address respectively. And finally, unemployed youth who were at 21% and 22%, and we know that under this Conservative government, it's continuously rising number of young people who are unemployed and continue to be underemployed. And if we're at a rate of 21 and 22% of our young people who are unemployed who can't vote, that's a significant number of our population that the Conservatives are making sure are not voting, are not participating, are not exercising their franchise. That so many people who came before us make sure to fight so that we could have access to vote.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires?
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I rise, it is because I would like to congratulate my colleague on her excellent speech, and I want to talk about something that happened not too long ago. There were seniors who went to vote. As you know, in Quebec, the health card does not have either a photo or an address on it, so they couldn't use that. These people are living in a residence and don't have their driving license anymore, and they were not able to vote. When they got their papers, they filled them out, but they went with that information and they were told that they could not vote. Now we are going to be asking people for even more information, more ID. Before, people were enumerated. They got their card in the mail. There was a margin of error, but that always happens. They could go to vote with that card. Now there is confusion at the polls. The officials don't really know who can vote, and they keep asking for more and more information. So my question is whether my colleague doesn't think that there are even more people who will be disenfranchised the next time around.
A short answer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague again for her question and intervention. Absolutely, there will be far more Canadians who are going to be disenfranchised from voting. We're at a situation in this country where voter turnout is continuing to decrease, and my constituency is the one that had the second lowest voter turnout in the 2008 election, and because local community members took it upon themselves to create voter education campaigns over the time between the 2008 election and since the 2008 election and the 2011 election, we were able to increase voter turnout by 18% in Scarborough Rouge River because local community members were the ones who were educating. And Elections Canada had the opportunity to do that type of education and ensure that young people are being enumerated and making sure that new Canadians know how to vote and when to vote. And we increased voter turnout by 18% in one federal election, Mr. Speaker, and that is the type of thing that should be happening across this country. When there's 60% or less than 60% of Canadians voting, that's an absolute shame. We need to be having more Canadians making sure that their voice is heard, and your voice is your vote, and Canadians need to be using it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate. Reprise de